So here we are in Chapter 1 of The Revenge of the Wizard's Ghost, and we have discovered that revenge is of the wizard from the last book, The Spell of the Sorcerer's Skull, Warren Windrow, whose soul still walks the earth. But Johnny doesn't really want to say anything to Fergie or the professor, even though the professor realizes that something is up with Johnny, and Johnny lets a little bit slip, asking the professor if he believes in dreams. So we will pick up from where we left off. By midnight, everyone on Fillmore Street was asleep. The temperature had dropped sharply, and fog began to drift into the town. It slithered past the Dixon house in ghostly curls and eddies, and one long gray finger of mist rose up to touch the half-open window of the room where Johnny lay asleep. Suddenly Johnny sat up. With wide-open, unseeing eyes, he turned his head, peeled back the sheet, and slid out of bed. Moving stiffly, he walked out of the room, down the front stairs and out onto the sidewalk. It was a chilly night, and he was wearing only thin cotton pajamas. Nevertheless, he did not seem to feel the cold. Down the foggy street he went, walking for blocks and blocks till he came to the edge of town. He crunched over the gravel that bordered a narrow blacktop road, but if the gravel hurt his bare feet, he didn't notice. Suddenly he stopped. Off to the right, in a weedy yard, was an old white schoolhouse with boarded windows. Stumping along woodenly like a robot, Johnny made his way through the woods to the front steps of the school, and then, noiselessly, the old weathered door opened. Johnny disappeared inside for a fairly long time. When he came out again, his face still looked blank and his eyes were glazed, but his mouth was twisted into a harsh, brutal, sneering smile. The smile distorted Johnny's face and almost made him look like a different person. When Johnny woke up the next morning, he made a shocking discovery. His pajama bottoms were damp from the knees down, and his feet were dirty. There was gravel on his sheets, and there were gravelly footprints on the floor of his bedroom. What on earth had happened? Had he been walking in his sleep? It certainly looked like it, but where had he been to? Johnny felt panicky at first, and then, when he had calmed down a bit, he wondered what his grandmother would say about the dirty sheets and the footprints on the floor. As he sat thinking about this, someone knocked on the door. With a sinking heart, Johnny got up to answer it. There was Grandma, with a broom in one hand and a dustpan in the other. She did not seem to be in a very good mood. "John Dixon," she said in an accusing tone, "can you tell me about these footprints and this dirt I've been sweeping up on the front stairs, Johnny swallowed hard. "I guess I must have been walking in my sleep, Grandma," he said weakly. Grandma looked startled, and then her frown turned into a kindly smile. "I should have guessed," she said, shaking her head. "My Uncle Martin used to walk in his sleep, and it nearly drove his wife crazy. Well, look, you have to get ready for school, so get on down to the bathroom and wash up. Only tonight, remember to lock your bedroom door before you turn in. That'll keep you in, leastways that's what people claim. Now go on, get a move on." Johnny ran quickly down the hall to the bathroom and heaved a deep sigh of relief. But as he brushed his teeth, the nagging questions came back. Why had he been walking in his sleep, and where had he gone? As the days of October passed, Johnny began to behave strangely. He took long walks by himself, and he found that he was thinking about some very peculiar things. He thought about bags of gold dust and men panning for gold in mountain streams. He kept playing poker games in his mind, and he would mutter things like, "4 of a kind beats a full house. See you and raise you $20. Pair of jacks bets." He thought of gold coins and silver dollars clattering on tables in smoky, dimly lit saloons. He thought about grizzled, sunburned men who carried long-barreled six-shooters and leather holsters. And he thought about knife fights, too. Sometimes, on these long, lonely walks, Johnny would feel himself getting very angry. He was angry at a smug, superior-acting young bearded man who always won at cards and threw money around as if it meant nothing to him. But who was this man? Johnny hadn't the slightest idea. At night, Johnny began to have dreams that were even more frightening than the ones he had been having before. In these dreams, he was led out onto a rough wooden stage with a trap door in the middle. Down below the edge of the stage, Johnny saw a sea of upturned faces, men and women who sneered and mocked and laughed at him. His arms were tied behind him, and someone was shoving him out into the middle of the platform. He tried to struggle, but it was no use. He was standing on the trap door, and someone was lashing his feet together with a leather strap. The noose dangled overhead, and he saw it drop lower, and felt the rough, hairy rope around his neck. The noose tightened, and a black sack was draped over his head. Johnny began to scream, and then he was falling. Johnny would wake up in a state of panic, with a feeling of tightness around his throat. Whenever Johnny had this dream, he found that it was impossible to go to sleep again that night. People began to notice that there was something the matter with Johnny. He would show up at the breakfast table with a wild, haunted look on his face, and his grandmother and grandfather would glance at each other in a frightened way, and they would ask if he felt all right. Johnny would snap at them and say that of course he felt all right, and that would end the conversation. In school, Johnny was doing badly. Usually he did very well in subjects like Latin, history, English, and science. Johnny was a real brain. But now his mind went blank. When he tried to read or answer test questions, and when he attempted to concentrate on homework, a voice would whisper in his ear and tell him to forget about his work. It wasn't really important. This whispering, insistent voice was with Johnny much of the day now. When he was with his friend Fergie, it would ask him why he spent so much time with this ugly, gawky oaf. When he was with the professor, it would tell him that the old man was a rather strange companion for a young, handsome lad like himself. Johnny didn't always listen to the voice, or obey it. In fact, he tried very hard to fight the whisperer and make him go away, but as time went by, he began to get the horrible feeling that there was somebody else inside him, someone who was trying to take over. One windy evening, in the middle of October, Johnny and his friend Fergie were over at the professor's house for a card party. Fergie was a gangly kid with a droopy face and a long, blunt-ended nose. He had big ears and big feet, and he was always making jokes. Johnny had met Fergie a year ago at Boy Scout camp, and they had become friends quickly. Fergie had gotten to know the professor through Johnny, and now the three of them often did things together. The card party turned out to be a lot of fun for the two boys and the old man. They drank lots of hot spiced cider and gorged on Rigojansky, which is a kind of super chocolate torte with two kinds of flavored whipped cream and fondant frosting on top. They did all their gobbling in the kitchen, and then they took their cider mugs out to the dining room and sat down to play hearts. As they played, the professor was watching Johnny closely. He knew that there was something wrong with Johnny, and he was trying to figure out what it was. Oddly enough, Johnny wanted to tell the professor about his problems, but he was scared to. The voice inside him told Johnny that awful things would happen to him if he tried to talk to the old man, so he just clammed up. In the middle of the game, a peculiar thing happened. The professor led with the king of clubs. Johnny threw on a jack, and Fergie laid down the four. Johnny's eyes grew wide. "The four of clubs!" he exclaimed. "That's the devil's bedpost. It's bad luck." The professor's mouth dropped open. "The devil's bedposts? Where in the name of Ned did you dig up that expression?" Johnny shrugged. "Where I come from, they say it all the time," he muttered. Fergie opened his mouth to say something, but he saw the fierce glare on Johnny's face, so he said nothing. The game went on in silence for some time, but finally the professor decided that he had had enough. He was angry and puzzled, and he felt hurt. "John," he said, throwing his cards down suddenly on the table, "I really have had about all I can take from you. You seemed to be having a good time earlier this evening, and then you turned into a gloomy Gus. I just don't get it." Tears came to the professor's eyes. He was really very upset. "John," he said in a trembling voice, "I thought I was your friend. You always used to tell me your troubles. Why won't you tell me now?" Johnny laid his cards down on the table in front of him. He stared at the professor, and a change came over his face. His eyes grew hard, and his lips curled into a sneer. "Because you're a childermass," he said hatefully, "and they are the enemy." As the professor and Fergie watched in utter astonishment, Johnny reached out and with a swipe of his hand knocked his mug of cider over. Then he shoved his chair back, jumped up, and ran out of the house, slamming the front door behind him. And that's the end of Chapter 1.